guys, you get to listen to your fabulous teacher read Sisters Grimm, The Unusual Suspect, Chapter 5. If you want to follow along with me, we are on page 92. Granny Relda swung her handbag at the frog girl and cracked her on the forehead. The monster groaned and fell to the floor. Sabrina knew the sort of stuff the old woman kept in her purse. Everything from spy goggles to a roll of quarters. It packed quite a wallop. So she was surprised when the frog girl stirred and then struggled to stand. No wasting any time, the Grimms spun in the opposite direction and raced down the stairs. Elvis followed close behind, clumsily navigating the steep steps and barking threateningly. "If we're lucky," Granny Relda said through her winded breaths, "the creature will be too afraid of Elvis to come after us." "And if we aren't?" Sabrina asked, as to help her grandmother down the last step. Unfortunately, Sabrina's worries came true. The frog girl bounced down the steps and into a nearby wall, sticking like a suction cup. "Your puppy isn't very nice," the frog girl croaked, "but he'll digest in my belly as quickly as the three of you." Daphne stepped forward and flashed her shiny new deputy badge. "You're under arrest for, being gross," she stammered. But the frog girl was not impressed. She lunged for the little girl, but Sabrina grabbed Daphne's hand and dragged her down the hallway and towards the exit. The monster gave chase, leaping from wall to wall, gaining ground with each jump. So by the time the Grimms reached the exit, the frog girl was breathing down their necks. She shot her thick tongue out and wrapped it around Daphne's arm, dragging the little girl back into her clutches. Elvis snapped viciously at the creature, but she jumped to the ceiling and hung upside down out of reach. "Let her go!" Sabrina shouted. The frog girl let out a sickening giggle and continued to dangle Daphne right out of Sabrina's reach. The little girl struggled and squirmed, then finally reached into her beehive hairdo and yanked out the protractor she kept out of her sticky locks. She stabbed the frog's tongue with a pointy tip, and the monster shrieked, releasing her. Sabrina landed hard and knocked Sabrina to the ground. "And you didn't like my hairdo," Sabrina said to her sister. Sabrina quickly helped the little girl to her feet, and the two ran to the exit door, and with Granny Relda and Elvis close behind. They pushed the door open and ran into the chilly air, making a beeline for the parking lot. "Start the car!" Sabrina shouted as they sprinted across the school lawn. Mr. Canis was still meditating on top of the car. He opened his eyes and without pausing climbed off the roof, and within seconds he was in the old jalopy roaring. The sound of the metal grinding metal on metal filled the air, and the machine shook violently. The old junker's obnoxious concert had never sounded so good to Sabrina. "I assume there's a problem," Mr. Canis said, as Elvis, Granny, and the girls clambered into the car. No one got a chance to explain. Something slammed on the roof. It was so loud that they all jumped, well, except Mr. Canis, whose only a reaction was to look up and raise a questioning eyebrow. A slimy green hand smacked the driver's side window, and Sabrina and Daphne screamed. Granny Relda whooped in astonishment, and Elvis growled and bared his teeth. Mr. Canis, however, took a deep breath, pulled the car into drive, and stomped on the gas. The tires spilled, and the car rocketed into the street, skidding across the country road before some quick steering set it straight. "So it appears your monster theory was correct," Mr. Canis said, as the creature pounded on the roof. "Indeed, though I did like to amend my theory by saying that there is more than just one monster involved," Granny Relda said. "Old friend, I thought our passenger on the roof might be a little difficult to shake. Perhaps I should drive." know very well the police took your license away," Mr. Canis said, steering from one side of the road to the other in an effort to dislodge their stowaway upstairs. Unfortunately, nothing the old man had any effect on the monster, and she continued to be beat violently on the roof. "They completely overreacted, Mr. Canis. It was just a couple of speeding tickets," Granny said defiantly, or defensively. "You were arrested 14 times for reckless endangerment. Several neighborhood groups banned you from driving on their streets. Basel told the German government they passed a law in Berlin that says if you were ever caught in a car in their city, you will be hanged." Ooh, the old man corrected. "Oh, Mr. Canis," Granny begged. "No one ever has to know." He shook his head. "Please." Mr. Canis slammed on the brake pedal, and the car screeched to a halt. The frog girl tumbled down the hood and bounced along the road several yards. She let out a horrible moan and then laid still. "You have to stay off major roads," the old man said. Granny squealed with delight. Mr. Canis got out of the car and walked down to the passenger side, while Granny scooted over to the driver's seat. As they switched places, Sabrina watched the grotesque frog girl, stir slowly to get to her feet and stare at the car. Even with her bizarre twisted face, the murderous rage in her eyes was very clear. "Is this the best time to change drivers?" Sabrina asked. "Children," Mr. Canis said as he turned to face his sisters, "put on your seatbelts, and if you have any final words for your maker, I suggest you pray." The girls eyed each other nervously. Unfortunately, the ancient seatbelts installed in the car were torn, so Mr. Canis used ropes to improvise. Sabrina helped Daphne tie hers into a knot around her waist and then worked on her own while Granny rubbed the engine and giggled. "Uh-oh. I feel so alive," the old woman said. The frog girl leaped in the air and came down violently on the car's front end. The impact was so great, the car's back end lifted a full 4 feet off the ground and then came down hard. The monster leaned forward to get a better look through the windshield and then licked her wide lips. "Going somewhere?" she laughed. "I almost felt sorry for the ugly thing," Mr. Canis said with a sigh. Granny floored the accelerator and the car lunged forward. The monster tumbled over the hood, up the windshield, over the roof, and onto the trunk, and fell off the back end of the car. "She's gone," Sabrina cried, as she watched the creature disappear behind them. But no sooner had she stopped cheering than the freak hopped back onto the trunk. "She's back!" Daphne shouted, diving under the blanket with Elvis. Granny made a sharp left turn onto an old dirt road and pressed hard on the gas pedal. The ancient car screamed in protest, but jumped ahead with a burst of speed so powerful Sabrina felt the G-force pushing her body onto the seat springs. Granny's steering left a lot to be despaired. She plowed through the shrubbery, down a picket fence, and smashed 4 mailboxes without even flinching. "Perhaps you might like to stay on the road," Mr. Canis shouted over the noise. "This is so much fun!" Granny rolled a cheer. Despite the incredible speed and the flying debris, the frog girl held on with little effort and pounded angrily on the rear mirror. Her massive blows created a thick crack in the glass. It wouldn't hold much longer. "Turning right," shouted Granny from the driver's seat just before she made an impossibly sharp turn. Elvis tumbled over the girls as the car banked, but the maneuver didn't seem to shake the monster. "Turning left," Granny shouted, and Elvis tumbled to the other side of the car, landing heavily on Sabrina's belly and knocking the wind out of her. The frog girl smacked the window again, and this time it exploded, sending chunks of glass into the back seat. Several large portions of the window stayed attached, but the monster pulled them off effortlessly and tossed them into the road. Then she reached in the back seat with her sticky hand, unfastened Daphne's rope belt, and snatched the little girl right out of her seat. Sabrina desperately grabbed at Daphne's ankles and tried to pull her back into the car, but the monster's grip was just too strong. Mr. Canis sprang into action. He rolled down the window and pulled his upper body out of the speeding car. "There's no need to hurry, old man," the frog girl screamed over the wind. "You'll die soon enough." The ferocious roar echoed back at the monster, and Sabrina could see her eyes grow wide with surprise. "You're the traitor!" the frog girl cried. "I've heard of you, the big bad wolf, trying to make amends for all the bad things you've done. You'll fail, old timer. Your heart isn't in it. But no matter, I'll give you the dignity of knowing you died trying." "Put the girl back in the car," Mr. Canis demanded, even over the roaring engine, "or you'll experience the kind of bad things I used to do." The frog girl laughed. She reached into the back seat with her free arm and grasped for Sabrina, who squirmed and slapped at the disgusting hand, but couldn't avoid being yanked out of the window by her sweater. The wind slapped at her face and howled in her ears as she struggled to free herself. Mr. Canis was too far to do anything, and the frog girl knew it. If Sabrina and her sister were going to survive, they were going to have to save themselves. "Daphne, do you remember Mr. Oberlin?" Sabrina shouted, hoping one of their more abusive foster fathers was still in Daphne's memory. "From the Bronx?" the little girl asked. Sabrina nodded. The expression on Daphne's face told Sabrina her plan wasn't the little girl's favorite. Regardless, Daphne nodded, and together the sisters leaned over and bit the frog girl hard. The monster shrieked and let go of them. Sabrina grabbed the frame of the window with one hand and the sister with the other, and together they scrambled back into the car. "What happened?" Granny Relda asked, still pushing hard on the gas. "It appears I'm not the only one in our home with fangs," Mr. Canis said, climbing out of the car. "Can you get rid of that thing and fast?" Daphne cried. "I need to get home and brush the ugh out of my mouth." "Don't worry, livelings," Granny said as she made a rough turn onto the gravel road. "I have a plan." "Relda, are you sure about this?" Mr. Canis asked as he strapped his seatbelt around himself. "Absolutely." Sabrina peered through the front windshield and saw a sign blocking the road ahead. It read, "Danger, bridge unsafe. Go no further." Worse was what lay beyond it. In the distance was an old, run-down bridge covered in a rocky stream. A mouse couldn't have crossed it safely, let alone an ancient 2-ton monstrosity on wheels. "What's Granny's plan?" Daphne asked, smacking at the frog's hand as it snatched at her through the window. "You don't want to know," Sabrina replied, as she once again strapped Daphne into her seat. The car crashed through the old wooden side, and it exploded around them. A chunk slid over the roof, and by the sound of the pained groan, smacked the monster in her head. Unfortunately, Granny didn't stop driving, and when the jalopy raced onto the rickety bridge, Sabrina knew they were in trouble. Creaking beams and snapping wood drowned out the car's backfire and grinding gears. The old bridge tilted to the left just as the car reached the halfway point, and Sabrina saw something that nearly gave her a heart attack. The middle of the bridge was collapsed, leaving a giant hole no car could ever get across. Granny wasn't slowing down. "We're not going to make it," Sabrina shouted, battling the roaring engine to be heard. "I love pancakes too," the old woman shouted back. "I hate this car," Sabrina thought to herself. "What are you fools doing?" the frog girl cried. Granny Relda floored the accelerator and the engine screamed. A flame shot out of the car's muffler, and suddenly they were soaring over the gaping hole. Sabrina looked out the back window and watched their unwanted passenger lose her grip on the car and fly into the air. And when the car landed hard on the other side, the frog girl did not follow. Sabrina watched the creature crash through the collapsed section of the bridge. Then watched the structure buckle and collapse onto the rocky stream below. Woo! Granny cried as she brought the car to a screeching stop. Oh boy, did Froggy get the surprise of her life. How exciting was that? Were you excited? I'm having a blast. If you put Granny Relda behind the wheel, things get done. Mr. Kranos reached over and turned the car off and then pocketed the keys. The car backfired and then sat silently as if troubled by what had happened to it. Everyone followed suit, except for Elvis, who whined softly. Well, I guess I'll just drive us home, Granny said. Everyone shouted, no! In unison. Sabrina saw the disappointment in her grandmother's face, and the old woman slowly got out of the car, and Mr. Canis slid over into the driver's seat as she got into the passenger side. Granny Relda crossed her arms and pouted. It reminded Sabrina of something Daphne would do. Sorry for the dogs back there. My driving isn't that bad, the old woman said. Yes, everyone shouted. The family staggered back into their home, and Sabrina quietly cursing one of the worst days of her life. They found Puck sprawled across the couch. He had moved several stacks of books away from the television and was watching it with the sound all the way up. 3 delivery pizza boxes, countless bags of chips, a leaky carton of ice cream, and a half 2-liter bottle of soda littered the floor. He balanced a can of spray cheese on his belly, and when he saw the family limp into the house, he lifted the cheese can, sprayed an enormous portion into his mouth, and then offered them the can. When no one took him up on his offer, he gargled the greasy cheese junk food and swallowed it. An enormous, window-rattling belch followed. Old lady, he crowed, you've been hiding this magic box from me? You can spy on other worlds with it. I just watched a man and his talking car jump across a river. He's talking about the TV. See, Sabrina's exhaustion turned to anger, and from the expression on the rest of the family's faces, she could see they felt the same way. While they've been fighting off a frog monster, Puck had been sitting here having the best day of his life. Man, is life unfair. What? He asked defensively, spraying more cheese into his mouth. While Granny cooked dinner, the girls patiently explained to Puck all that would happen at the school and Mayor Charming's house, and the boys seemed to think Mr. Grutner's murder was fascinating and was terribly depressed that he hadn't seen the frog girl. Was she ugly? He asked. Very, Daphne said. I'm going to have nightmares. Why is it that I miss all the fun stuff? Puck complained. I guess you just don't have our luck, Sabrina said. Well, I hope the 2 of you wash your hands when you got home, he said to the girls. Frogs give you warts, and it sounds like the one you fought off was mighty big. I wouldn't be surprised if you wake up in the morning and you find you've turned into a big, giant, brown wart. Daphne's eyes grew as big as saucers. She said. It's true. If you hurry and take a bath, it might not be too late, Puck advised. The little girl rushed out of the kitchen and could be heard running up the stairs to the bathroom. You shouldn't tease her like that, Sabrina said, shaking her hands and the kitchen sink. Puck, Puck, do you know the widow? Granny asked as she stirred a pot of soup over the stove. Of course, Puck replied. Queen of the Crows. Could you ask her to come for a visit? Granny Relda said. Why? He asked. Are you going to cook her? Of course not, Granny said, horrified. I just have some questions for her. She might be able to help us with our case." "Since when does a trickster king act as your messenger, old lady?" the boy asked. "Since you started living under my roof, or her roof," Mr. Canis growled. He slammed his fist down hard on the kitchen counter, causing the sugar bowl to lose its lid. "This is serious business, boy. Now go!" Puck eyed Canis in shock, but after a moment his glistening wings popped out and flapped loudly. He flew quickly through the house and slammed the front door behind him. Mr. Canis leaned against the table to catch his breath. I was too hard on him," he said with regret. Granny Relda patted the old man on the shoulder. "Go and rest." "There may be more danger," Mr. Canis insisted. "A perfectly good reason to get a little sleep while you can," Granny Relda said. "Go, no arguments." The old man nodded and shuffled out of the room. "Who's the widow?" Sabrina asked. Granny crossed the room and snatched a large book of fairy tales off the shelf. She placed it in front of Sabrina and smiled, and the author was listed was Hans Christian Andersen. Hans Christian Andersen wrote about her in Snow White, the Snow Queen. She's an old friend. She might be able to shed some light on the crow feathers that we found. She's sort of an expert on birds. It couldn't hurt if you read the Andersens' account of her. "Do you think birds had something to do with the murder?" Sabrina asked as she flipped through the heavy book. "It's hard to say," the old woman said, "but the widow, she will know for sure." Daphne's skin was red from scrubbing, and her hair was wrapped up with a big white towel when she and Sabrina gathered in the dining room for dinner. Puck had not returned, and Mr. Canis decided to pass on eating. So the girls took their seats, and Granny served hot soup and buttered rolls to them. Like all of Granny's cooking, the soup took some getting used to. It tasted like warm butterscotch pudding, but Sabrina was so hungry she didn't have the strength to complain. Between slurps, the old woman jotted notes in her notebook. "So let's review what we know. Mr. Grubner was found dead inside a giant spider web. Black feathers were found on the bottom of the broken window, and the scarlet hand symbol was left at the scene. And we were attacked by Kermit the Frog's evil sister," Daphne added. "Which is the foundation of my theory, girls. I believe we have two monsters on our hand now," Granny Relda said. "Who?" Sabrina cried. "The frog girl, for one. But I don't know if she's involved in the murder. That was definitely done by a spider, of course." "Of course," Sabrina said sarcastically. "Why couldn't it have just been done by the frog girl?" "Well, frogs don't spin webs," Granny said. "Duh," Sabrina said, and then took a big bite out of her roll. What?" Sabrina swallowed. "A giant spider," she repeated, then immediately stuffed another oversized bite into her mouth. "Agreed. One normal spider can never trap a human being," Granny said. "What about Charming's army of spiders idea?" Sabrina asked. "It's still a possibility," Granny said, scribbling more notes in her notebook. "If it was an army of spiders, it would explain the broken window," Sabrina said, suddenly realizing how insane the world she now lived in sounded in her ears. "Maybe," Granny replied. "I just don't think so," the girl asked. You don't think so?" the girl asked. The glass was all over the floor, so something certainly came through the window. But the shards were everywhere, which tells us whatever it was came very fast. "Are Daphne mumbled with a mouthful of soup. "Right, birds," Sabrina said. "The black feathers were underneath the window, and that's where I get confused. Were the birds helping the spider monster?" "Birds and spiders do not work together," Granny Relda explained. "Birds eat spiders." Granny stood up and crossed the room with a pile of books stacked next to the radiator. She tugged out a couple in the middle of the stack and sent the rest tumbling to the floor. She left the fallen pile where it is and returned to the table. "This book is about This book has just about everything ever written on giant animals, Granny Relda said, setting in front of the girls. It's a bit dry, and the author has an unhealthy fear of certain animals, but it might be helpful. Sabrina eyed the book, entitled Magical Mutations of Insects, Reptiles, and Kitties. She opened the cover and saw a crude drawing of a giant kitten chewing on several screaming knights. She flipped to another page, and a thin pamphlet fell out. She picked it up and examined it. The cover read, Rumpelstiltskin's Secret Nature. What's this? She asked, leafing through it. The pages were filled with tiny, neat writing. I've been looking for that for ages, Granny said. That's your great Matilda Grimm. Your great Matilda Grimm wrote that. Daphne took the pamphlet. What does that say? It's called Rumpelstiltskin's Secret Nature, her grandmother said, taking the booklet from the little girl. Matilda was obsessed with Rumpelstiltskin. You could say she was a Rumpelstiltskin specialist. Isn't that the guy who made the lady guess his real name? Daphne asked. Granny nodded. Matilda had dozens of theories on why he tricked people out of their firstborn child, but he spun gold from straw. Where he came from, she thought it would be, I lost my spot, sorry. He tricked people out of their firstborn children. How he spun gold from straw, where he came from, he thought he could manipulate people into making bad choices. You should read this when you get a chance. Anyone for more camel hump soup? Ooh, that sounds gross. And if you don't know the story of Rumpelstiltskin, you might want to take a second and read that or watch a video of the story later so you know who Rumpelstiltskin is. So Sabrina let the spoonful of soup she was about to put into her mouth drop out into her bowl with a splash. This was made with a camel hump, she cried. Images of sweaty fleas covering a camel danced in her mind. She had seen one at the Bronx Zoo with her father and remembered it spitting at her. She could still smell the rank breath years later, and she felt sick. Actually, it's two-hump camel soup, but I only used the second hump, Granny Relda explained. The first hump was a little too tough, and besides, it's the second hump that has all the flavor anyways. The girl stared at the old woman as if she were playing an elaborate joke on them, but Sabrina could see from her expression that she was serious. Of course, Daphne clapped her hands happily and cried, I'll have more, and this time can you put an extra hump in there? Sabrina slowly pushed her nearly empty bowl away just as she heard a knock on the front door. You heard Jessie talking to me. Granny, who was on her way to the kitchen, stopped and rushed to answer it, with the girls following right on her heels. There on the porch stood a humongous black crow. Its head bobbed nervously, and its squawk was ear-shattering. On one of its legs was a black ribbon, and when it saw the family, it dipped its head in what Sabrina guessed was a bow of respect. Good afternoon, widow, Granny Relda said to the bird. Good afternoon to you, Relda Grimm, the crow croaked in a scratchy yet feminine voice. Daphne squealed in glee and bit down hard on the palm of her hand, but Sabrina's stomach did a flip-flop. More talking animals? Ugh. Miss Grimm, did you know the little brat you sent plucked a feather out of my behind and left? The crow complained. I'm deeply sorry, Granny Relda apologized. I do appreciate you coming to visit. Well, the boy said, it was important. I would have to come in my human form. But at this time of night, the traffic can just be a killer, and I took the 7 down to 40 and got off Miller Road. But, you know, that disaster with all the orange cones, and right now the 18 is backed for miles. So I parked it on the side of the road and transformed. I don't know why I bother with a car. Flying is really the quickest and easiest way, the bird croaked. Your English is coming along very well, Granny Relda commented. Thank you, the crow called. Some of my brothers and sisters refuse to speak anything but crowish, but I say you have to adapt, and it's good to learn new things. I've even taken up paddleboarding. What fun, Granny said with a smile. I was wondering if you'd had heard anything about the human who was killed today at the elementary school. Indeed I have, the widow replied. What Want to know how I know? Granny nodded. A little bird told me, the crow said, and for a moment there was silence. Do you get it? A little bird told me. That's very funny, the old woman said, as a pained smile crossed her face and Sabrina rolled her eyes, but Daphne laughed so hard she snorted. Oh, I like the little one, the crow chuckled. You gotta have a good sense of humor to live in this town. That is true. So, as I was saying, the death was very suspicious, and we found this at the crime scene. Granny Relda said as she took the black feather they found in the classroom, pulled it out of her handbag, and held it out to the massive bird. Yes, it's all the flock can talk about, the widow said, eyeing the feather. Oh, Relda asked. The bird hesitated and looked around as if someone might be listening. Some of my brothers and sisters can't afford for about 15, excuse me. All of my brothers and sisters can't account for about 15 minutes of the day, the crow whispered. They have no memory of what happened. All they know is they heard music and then wham! They're all standing around the courtyard, unsure of how they even got there. That's very odd, Granny said. Have you heard who might be responsible? I think it's fairly obvious, Miss Grimm, the crow said. It was the Scarlet Hand. What makes you think so, widow? Sabrina asked. Only a few people knew about the red handprint on the blackboard. They've sent you a warning, ladies. You're messing around with some very bad people. Warnings? I don't know what you're talking about, said the old woman. You don't know? It's all over your house. Sabrina and Daphne and Granny Relda rushed down to the porch steps and turned around to look at their house. On the windows, the roof, on the chimney were red handprints. Who did this? Sabrina asked. How did they do this? We've been home for a while and we haven't heard anything, Sabrina added. The widow hopped down the street and flew into the air. Keep your nestlings close, the crow squawked, then disappeared over the tree line. Brittany reached down and took the girls by the hand. Girls, get back into the house, she said sternly. We're being watched. Dun, dun, dun. I hope you enjoyed chapter 5. Don't forget to go right now and type in, your quick summary of what happened during chapter 5 for Miss Hutchins and I to see.